to sabotage the phasers, but they won't let him in because he doesn't have an order from Sulu, who's the security chief, apparently. And I think this is like the only time on the original series that they've mentioned a security chief.
You did.
Unless
I'm pretty sure it is.
Because, like, I
How do
mean,
we know he's in charge of that if he doesn't say
hailing frequency.
hailing frequencies open? I can't do it without laughing. Sorry. Like, I just thought my dumb joke was so funny I couldn't even get it out without laughing. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I mean, I laugh at my own jokes. What can I say?
You should
At least I think I'm funny.
we should all laugh at our own jokes.
Okay, that makes me feel better. Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome. So yeah, in this universe, Sulu is the security chief. So Scotty cannot get into like the phaser room to sabotage them. So he calls up to the bridge and he's like, "No damage to the phasers, sorry." And Kirk, back on the bridge, he's still stalling for time. He's letting the targets move out of range as the planet orbits. And he basically calls the Halkin Council, tells them, "You've got 12 hours to change your mind. Tell Spock I'm going to be in my quarters." And tells Uhura that Scotty and McCoy should meet him there. She clearly wants to go there too. She'd rather not be on the bridge. Kirk is like, he shakes his head no, like, "You've got to stay here." I do think what's interesting about this whole dynamic of Uhura having to sort of be on her own on the bridge without the captain, because the only people who know what's really going on is the captain, Scotty, and Bones, right? But Uhura is on her own for a lot of this episode. Mm-hmm. And it really is a nice subtle way of showing how strong she is, because Kirk is like meant to be like the strong guy who could handle anything. Scotty and McCoy are teamed up in this episode, but Uhura's on her own. Like, she basically has to fend for herself, which she does the whole episode. So I think it's a nice subtle way of showing how strong of a character she is, how strong of a person she is, to be able to do that.
I agree with that.
For sure, yeah.
That's some good insight there.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, yeah, so it's also a cool thing being the 60s and she's a lady, and it's not like, you can't go in there by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You can't do this by, you can't. It's like, sorry, I know you can do it. You can do it. Go ahead. Like,
well, it was definitely also a big deal in the 60s to have a Black woman in a position of authority. Mm-hmm. Who, she was not a maid, she was not a slave, she was not a mammy, she was not any of those stereotypical things that Hollywood was doing. This was a Black woman who wore a uniform and had the rank of lieutenant, and she had real responsibilities on the bridge. Mm-hmm. And I mean, how important is that character? When you look back at the 60s, that's an incredibly important character that was put on the screen, not just for everybody to be like, "Oh wow, look at that," but think about all the young Black girls who saw that and who said, "I could do that. I see myself."
Like Whoopi Goldberg.
Whoopi Goldberg has said a million times that seeing Nichelle Nichols every week on Star Trek was a huge motivation for her. So, I mean, yeah, she's an incredibly important character, and I think that this episode, even if they don't mean for it to be that way, I don't know how much credit we can give writers here. I don't know how much credit we can give, the white guys who wrote this, but I'm just, I think
ended up being pretty important, no matter what they intended.
I think we have to give somebody credit. So it was either the writers outright are totally cool with it, and they're like, yeah, hey, they're not like, wouldn't it be funny if, like, Uhura was by herself and she was being really badass, that'd be hilarious. It wasn't like that. Or maybe Gene Roddenberry or something, like, for the whole series, because, I mean, even, like, to fast forward 20 years to, me watching Saved by the Bell, like, that was written by a bunch of middle-aged white men, and there were some times when it was really problematic in the 80s. like more problematic than this sci-fi show in the 60s, you know? If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. No,
I mean, if you've seen Saved by the Bell, it probably makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I think that maybe we could spread the credit around a little bit. And I mean, I would go so far as to say, even though she's not credited in any way on this episode, I mean, this was the time that DC Fontana was working with Star Trek. She was a staff writer. She was working closely with Gene Roddenberry. I mean, I'd like to think that maybe she had some input here. And I'd like to think that the writers of this show, with Gene Roddenberry being the visionary of it, that there was that sort of a let's let Uhura shine over here. Let's show how strong she is by putting her in this situation and having her come out on top. I mean, I hope so. I hope so. But here we are in 2020 still talking about it, and we can see it. So I mean, I think there is definitely some forethought here, which is good. As Kirk leaves the bridge, Chekhov starts mysteriously pushing buttons on his console, and he leaves also with Kirk in the turbolift. Spock tells him that he will have to report Kirk to Starfleet because he is basically disobeying orders. Kirk's like, "Do what you got to do, bro. I'm giving them the 12 hours." That's paraphrased. And so
no.
Yeah, but
No,
you're
really?
paraphrasing. Putting bro in everybody's mouth is always my favorite.
I add bro a lot, and it just feels right. So I just like throw out bro and dude a lot because I don't know, it speaks to me for some reason. So Chekhov and Kirk are headed to deck 5. They exit the turbo lift, and this is the most epic attack I've ever seen. Just out of nowhere, the doors open, and you don't even see the guy. You just see an arm and a hand just pow right to the face. I mean, this is like Worf style, like pow right to the face.
Right in the kisser.
Kirk's reaction is pretty fun.
He's just like,
whoa.
what? It's so amazing. I mean, one smack and he's down. So although it was a pretty epic smack. I'd probably be unconscious if somebody did that to me. Um, so of course, Chekhov has orchestrated all of this. These are his goons. He tells Kirk that he's going to assassinate him. Everybody moves up in rank, and that nobody's going to question it because Kirk has disobeyed orders. So it's not like Starfleet's going to be terribly upset about it. And then, so we get a little act break here. So we come back. Chekhov is holding that phaser on Kirk, and then one of the bad guys switches sides. He starts fighting off Chekhov and his guys. We get some of that. And this episode features us a lot of the overhead shot of the fighting. So it's like the camera, and Neil, you could probably explain it better than I can, but like with like the way that they have the camera, it's like this overhead down looking shot, which lets you use, I guess, your stunt doubles a lot easier. So it's not
because you're not catching faces as much.
Yeah.
You are catching bad wigs really well, but
oh yeah.
What?
Yeah. I know. We get some pretty like standard Star Trek scuffling, punching, karate chopping, fighting style that is quite popular in this show. Two of the guards are killed, and then Kirk's kind of personal guards show up. And the bad guy says, hey, Chekhov was going to make me a chief, but, you can make me an officer. And Kirk's like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe you'll even be captain. Who knows? And then he punches the guy out. And he's like, not on my ship, buddy. Which is just like hilarious. Thanks for saving my life. Now I'll just punch you right in the face. But it kind of is. I mean, you see Kirk trying to fit in, right? You would imagine he's like, all right, what would my counterpart do here? He'd probably have to like show how tough he is. So I better punch this guy in the face. And then they say that they're going to take Chekhov to the booth. It's very ominous sounding. We'll check in on Chekhov a little bit later and see what's happening in the booth. So then Kirk is in his Kirk shows up in his quarters. McCoy and Scotty are waiting for him there. McCoy sees that, Kirk is like kind of banged up and he's like, "What's this?" And Kirk goes, "It's blood." It's the most sarcastic I've ever
Yeah.
it's called blood. Ever heard of it? Like it's very it's very sarcastic and pretty funny. Um he tells McCoy and Scotty that they've got to watch out for this assassination promotion policy on the ship. Scotty says that Sulu is like the ancient Gestapo security chief. And then McCoy says in sickbay, they're betting on how much pain a crew member can withstand before
God.
he passes out. This is like the ship of hell. Like, what is
Yeah.
happening on this ship? I
Oh
don't know
man.
anything ever who's keeping track of duty rosters? Like, how does this ship function? Like, it's just a bunch of like rowdy pirates on a ship. It's pretty loose.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they have the same uniform code of conduct that that the Federation Starfleet does.
Yeah, pretty much not. I would be interested to see what Starfleet Academy is like in this universe. I'd be really
boy.
interested.
Oh man.
It's yeah. So so now Kirk basically uses the computer because it's the best way that they can figure out how to get home. So he kind of proposes to the computer like his hypothesis. The computer is confirming, yes, affirmative, affirmative. And basically he asks the computer like, could we recreate the conditions artificially? And the computer very helpfully and very conveniently says, "Yeah, here you go. Here are the instructions. I'll just download it right here onto this disk." And he gives it to Scotty. I mean, it's all very. I think about how this episode differs from like a Next Generation episode where there would be a lot more of the crew like talking about it, discovering it, maybe talking to the computer for an extended period of time. This happens in a span of about 2 minutes that they
Yeah.
find the solution. I mean, it's right, boom, to the point. It's a
Yeah,
very
that's
different, storytelling style.
it is very different from like next gen because it is more action oriented. I mean, most next gen episodes don't have a fist fight. This one has what, three?
Yeah. It has at least 3 fist fights, and a lot of slapping. And some Uhura taking on Marlena. Like you're
Yeah.
right. This is an action-heavy episode.
Action
Um,
packed.
action-packed.
Not to mention the sexy time that Kirk gets, which is I think
Oh.
a prerequisite for almost all the episodes.
We'll talk about some sexy time in a minute there. Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. Like the way that the story develops here, it definitely it's more of an action-heavy thing. The story, I think the story's a really good story.
Mhm.
The idea of like the parallel universe and how you could cross over. And certainly, I think like my only like, I guess nitpick is like they find the solution so fast. It's like, oh, okay. Well, glad you figured that out in 2 minutes. That's great. So
They weren't able to really incorporate technobabble as well as they could in next gen at this point either,
mhm.
because nobody knew what the hell they were talking about back then, and now more people are more familiar with the concepts.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, there is some technobabble in this episode, but there's very little. And I think as a whole, I would agree with you that original series did not have a ton of technobabble. It definitely relied on using words and maybe concepts that were probably more familiar to people in the 60s. I
Yeah.
think now, certainly, like if you go as far forward as like Picard, which we just watched, I mean that's even further into the future, and the technology is even more refined. They could do even more stuff with the technology. But now, like, if you turn on an episode of like Next Generation and you hear Geordi and Data techno babbling for 5 minutes about reversing polarity of the